And so they sent a strong letter of protest to the administrator, and the EPA backed off. So now I want to talk about, in the last few minutes, NOx and SOx, because new standards have just come out. And again, Terry, Kent, and I were on the KSEC panel for these two pollutants. It was one panel, but two separate processes. So nitrogen dioxide is an oxidant gas like ozone, but not as potent. It's an important precursor to ozone, and we heard yesterday whether NO2 has direct effects or it's a marker for traffic mixture effects people fight about. But it is, we're not regulating the traffic mixture at this point. We're still regulating single pollutants. That's a problem in my view, but that's what we're still doing. And so we have to look at NO2, the science under about NO2. So the primary standard for NO2 since 1971 had been an annual mean value, not to exceed 0.053 parts per million. So there was no place in the country that exceeded this for many years. So basically it was a standard with really no health protection behind it. And so I've been actually saying for years that the epidemiologic evidence that NO2 exposure increases the risk of lower respiratory infection in children and asthma exacerbation in children and adults, that annual averages didn't make any sense with regard to protecting public health. An annual average doesn't protect against peak exposures, and peak exposures are what you're worried about in terms of asthma exacerbations. So EPA did wrote an integrated science assessment, and I'm quoting from it here. That's why there's the US EPA logo. And the strongest evidence for an association between NO2 exposure and adverse human health effects comes from epi studies. I just really mentioned those. And that there were a lot of studies that suggested that there were effects well below this annual standard. And there was also evidence from human clinical studies. These are the controlled human exposure studies. Now this statement is pretty strong, but you see there's a generally supportive of the epidemiologic evidence, because these human experiments, which are strong evidence in support of health effects, it was mixed to some extent. I think that I signed off on this generally supportive of the epi evidence, but it wasn't like every study showed that asthmatics had increased twitchiness of their airways when they're exposed to NO2. And one of the controversies is what levels. At very high levels, most asthmatics will have increased twitchiness of their airways or hyperresponsiveness. At lower, closer to ambient levels, that's not as clear. But there's also animal mechanistic evidence, like if you give animals NO2 and then give them viral or bacterial infection, there'll be a greater infection attack rate after NO2 than compared to filtered air. So that fit in with increased respiratory infection epi studies. And then EPA did an exposure assessment, and I won't go into details here, but they focused on Atlanta because there was good epi data for Atlanta with regard to asthma, and so they spent a lot of time trying to come up with NO2 exposures in microenvironments. And by microenvironments, I mean living next to a freeway or downwind from a power plant. And basically they determined that based on this exposure assessment and risk assessment that virtually every asthmatic in Atlanta would experience exposures to NO2 that could cause them to have twitchy airways and could lead to an exacerbation. Under the, depending what level you pick a standard. So, and because we're trying to prevent asthma exacerbations, support was there for either a 1 hour or at most a 24-hour averaging time for the standard. And the ISA came out to say that the scientific evidence supports between 50 to 100 to 200 parts per billion, with pretty good evidence for 100 or lower. The final rule that was promulgated in, I guess it was last year, 2009, was a 1 hour, 100 parts per billion level. And just as an aside, the 0.053 part per million annual average is still in there. And I had to fight for that, because they just wanted to have a short-term standard. But there's evidence from the Children's Health Study in Southern California where they looked at growth of lung function in kids, and growth of lung function in kids exposed below that standard, 0.053 parts per million, was decreased. So EPA didn't think that there was strong enough evidence to regulate, to have a stricter annual standard based on that one study, even though it's a study of thousands of school kids in Southern California, very well conducted. But I was able at least to keep the annual standard in there. So in the future, if there are other studies that show that effect, we can strengthen the annual standard. So I want to end up with sulfur dioxide. This was recently promulgated earlier this month, the new standard. So sulfur dioxide isn't much of a problem in California compared to the East Coast, because we don't burn sulfur-containing coal or oil for power. But we do have issues related to sulfur and diesel, though we use low sulfur fuels in California. So it's mostly a point source issue in California, like being downwind from a refinery. But nationally, it's an issue. And the primary standard for SO2 was, again, an annual average and a 24-hour average, for many years. And the first study I ever did at UCSF, when I joined the same lab that Terry Gordon was in, this was in 1986, we showed that 5-minute exposures to relatively low levels of sulfur dioxide caused individuals with asthma to have airway narrowing. And my first encounter with CASAC was to testify before them, in the early 90s, about why there should be a short-term averaging time for SO2. And I was told that, asthmatics can just take bronchodilator when their airways get narrowed from sulfur dioxide. It's not really a health problem, not really an adverse health effect that we need to protect. So I was very pleased to be part of the CASAC effort that actually came up with a short-term standard, which I'm about to tell you. So the ISA for sulfur dioxide said there was a causal relationship between respiratory morbidity and short-term exposure to SO2. This is primarily with asthmatics. And the strongest evidence came from human exposure studies. That study that I did with that 5-minute exposure was suggested by an EPA staff person, John Bachman, because they wanted to know what was the shortest level of exposure or duration of exposure that would lead to airway narrowing. And there are some epi studies that support that asthmatics get into trouble when SO2 levels go up. It's not as strong as for ozone or NO2, though. And so then the risk exposure assessment that EPA did was in St. Louis and suburban county around St. Louis, and basically was similar to what they did with NO2 in Atlanta, though there was no good epi study in St. Louis. They just had good exposure data. And basically the bottom line was that 5 to 30% of exercising asthmatics, and exercise increases your exposure. You breathe faster, have greater minute ventilation when you're exercising, so there's greater effective dose of the pollutant. And they showed that between 230, 300 parts per billion SO2 for 5 to 10 minutes, there'd be decreased lung function, and up to 48,000 asthmatics would be expected to experience exposures above 200 parts per billion. And so what we recommended was 1 hour daily maximum within a range of 50 to 150 parts per billion. And that's so there's a margin of safety below that 200 parts per billion. And the final rule was 1 hour, 75 parts per billion. So